The old soldier who walked into Sacramento in 1,885 inches is a uniform from a war never fought. There is a photograph somewhere in the California State Archives, or there was, before a 1906 fire consumed a significant portion of Sacramento's municipal records that reportedly showed an old man in military dress standing in front of the Orleans Hotel on K Street. The photograph, if it existed, was described by at least two archivists in separate documents written between 1891 and 1903. Both descriptions note the same anomaly. The uniform is not recognizable, not Confederate, not Union, not Mexican-American War vintage, not anything from the frontier campaigns. The buttons are wrong. The cut is wrong. The collar insignia does not match any branch of the United States Army before or after the Civil War. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. And the man wearing it appeared to be in his late 70s or early 80s, which, if accurate, would place his birth somewhere around 1807. If you pull out a calendar and start counting, the arithmetic gets uncomfortable. A man born in 1807 who served in a war long enough to earn a full dress uniform, complete with campaign ribbons, rank insignia, and regimental markings should belong to a conflict the historical record can account for. The War of 1812 ended when he would have been 7. The Mexican-American War ran from 1846 to 1848, when he would have been in his late 30s old for an enlisted man. Not impossible. The Civil War ended in 1865, when he would have been in his late 50s. Any of these could explain a veteran in Sacramento in 1885. Soldiers from all those conflicts were still alive. Some were still walking around in their old uniforms. Veterans of the 1812 conflict were occasionally paraded at civic events well into the 1880s. But none of those wars produced the uniform described. That is the problem. That is the detail that does not resolve. If you enjoy content like this, investigations that go where the official record stops, consider sharing this video with someone who asks the right questions. That matters more than any algorithm. The man was not simply unidentified, he was questioned. And that is where the record gets strange, in a different way. According to a report filed by a Sacramento city clerk named Harold Beaumont on the 14th of September 1885, a man matching the description was brought to the city clerk's office after he was found sleeping in a doorway on J Street. The report is brief, 3 paragraphs, handwritten in ledger ink that has faded to a pale rust color. The city clerk's record describes the man as elderly, coherent, and without apparent distress, which suggests he was lucid enough to be questioned. The record notes that he gave his name as something the clerk transcribed phonetically as Aldrin, or possibly Aldrin V. The penmanship is unclear on the second character. It notes that he claimed to have travelled from the north. And it notes, almost as an afterthought, that he wore military dress of an unfamiliar pattern. What the record does not contain is any notation of unit, conflict, or state. In 1885, that information would have been standard. Veterans were processed through a system: pension rolls, discharge papers, regimental histories. A man in uniform walking into Sacramento would ordinarily leave a trail. Aldrin, or whatever his name was, left almost none. There is a follow-up entry in the same ledger, dated 3 days later, that simply reads, "Subject departed. No further record." That is all. 3 days in a city clerk's office. A name that cannot be fully read. A uniform that cannot be placed. And then nothing. The easiest explanation is the one most historians would reach for. The man was a fraud. A drifter in a costume, purchased at a second-hand shop, or assembled from multiple sources. Strange uniforms circulated in the post-Civil War period: theatrical costumes, foreign military surplus, odd pieces from private militias with no connection to official service. A man in his 70s wearing something unusual and claiming to be a veteran would not be the strangest thing on a Sacramento street in 1885. The city was a transit point. California still drew people with stories and not much else. That explanation is reasonable. It accounts for most of the evidence. But it does not account for all of it, because Harold Beaumont, the city clerk who filed that September report, wrote something else. Not in the official ledger, in a personal diary donated to the Sacramento Historical Society in 1931 by his granddaughter, sitting largely unexamined in their collection ever since. The diary entry for the 14th of September 1885 is longer than the official report by several paragraphs, and it contains details Beaumont clearly chose not to include in the formal record. He describes the uniform in more detail. He writes that the buttons bore a symbol he had never seen, not an eagle, not a wreath, not a star, but something he describes as a wheel with rays, pressed flat, in a yellow metal that did not look like brass. He writes that the collar insignia appeared to show a rank structure he could not interpret multiple bars, arranged in a pattern he compares to a cipher or a cartographer's notation. He writes that the fabric of the jacket was heavier than wool and yet finer, almost like a pressed felt, with a slight sheen that cloth of that weight should not carry. And he writes, in the last paragraph of that entry, something that he crosses out, though not so thoroughly that the words are illegible. The crossed-out sentence reads, "He spoke of a place I cannot find on any map I own." That sentence is the hinge. Everything before it can be explained away. Everything after depends on what weight you give to a city clerk's diary entry about a conversation he found important enough to partially conceal. We do not know what the man said. We do not know what place he named. We know only that Harold Beaumont, whose official job was to document things accurately, chose to record that detail privately and then tried to remove it. There is a class of historical incidents that researchers in alternative history communities have begun calling uniform anomalies, documented cases spread across the 19th century in which individuals appeared wearing military dress that could not be matched to any known conflict, branch, or national army. The Sacramento case is not the most prominent. Similar reports exist from St. Louis in 1871, from Toronto in 1883, from coastal Oregon in 1889. In each case, the individual is described as elderly, wearing dress uniform rather than field uniform, and unwilling to name a conflict the historical record acknowledges. The conventional explanation, when historians engage with these cases at all, is that the 19th century was full of veterans from overlapping conflicts. Uniforms were non-standard and often modified, and elderly men with fading memories sometimes confused or fabricated their histories. These are not unreasonable positions. The Civil War produced hundreds of thousands of veterans who spent subsequent decades being documented and occasionally lying about their service for pension purposes. Fraud was common. Memory was unreliable. But the uniform anomaly cases share a specific feature that separates them from ordinary fraud or confusion. In each documented instance, the witnesses describe the uniform in enough detail and with enough consistency across independent accounts that the theatrical costume explanation becomes harder to sustain. Theatrical military costumes of the 1870s and 1880s were meant to be read from a distance, not examined up close. The Sacramento uniform, as Beaumont describes it, was the opposite. It was precise in the wrong ways. The buttons were wrong, but consistently wrong. The insignia was unrecognizable, but deliberate. Something had created it with care, for a purpose the American military record does not contain. That specificity is what opens the door to a different set of questions. The Tartaria hypothesis, and it is worth being precise, because it gets used loosely, is not, in its more rigorous forms, a claim about a single lost civilization that built everything. It is a claim that the historical record of the 19th century contains systematic gaps, that events, institutions, populations, and periods were either not recorded or actively expunged from what survived. That the version of history we are taught is not a complete picture, but a curated one, assembled from records that were themselves selected, and the selection was not random. One of the subsidiary claims within that framework concerns military history. The argument runs like this. If there was a prior civilization operating on North American soil, with its own administrative infrastructure, its own territorial divisions, its own chain of command, then that civilization would have had a military. It would have had uniforms, ranks, insignia. And when that civilization ended, whether through catastrophe, suppression, or gradual erasure, the veterans of its military did not all simply disappear. Some of them continued to exist. Some of them were old. And some of them, perhaps, walked into Sacramento in 1885. This is a speculative framework. There is no direct evidence that the man before Harold Beaumont in September 1885 was a veteran of a prior civilization rather than an ordinary fraud or a confused elderly man. The evidence that exists is circumstantial, filtered through a clerk's diary entry and separated from us by more than a century of record loss. But the circumstantial evidence is not nothing. The record loss is worth examining. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire destroyed an enormous volume of California's historical documentation. Less frequently discussed is which records were housed where. Sacramento's municipal archives for the period between 1880 and 1900 are among the most significant casualties. The ledger containing Beaumont's September 1885 entry survived part of a collection transferred to a private historical society before 1906. But the records that would have contextualized it, pension processing files, transient registration logs, correspondence between Sacramento offices and the Federal Bureau of Pensions, are largely gone. This is not, by itself, evidence of deliberate suppression. Fires destroy records without regard to their content. The 1906 disaster was catastrophic across the board, and it would be naive to read intentionality into what was probably ordinary destruction by an ordinary disaster. But there is a pattern worth noting. The uniform anomaly cases appear in surviving records only because they survive in private documents, personal diaries, family letters, privately held ledgers, rather than in official archives. The official archives that would have contained parallel documentation are disproportionately absent, not absent in ways that can be attributed to anything other than ordinary record decay, but absent in a way that means the only surviving evidence is the kind that was never meant to enter official channels in the first place. Beaumont did not include the detail about the strange place name in his official report. He put it in his diary and then crossed it out. Whatever the man said, Beaumont's first instinct was to record it privately and then try to remove it. That is specific behavior, the behavior of someone who encountered something that did not fit available categories and made a judgment, conscious or not, that official channels were not the right place for it. There is a secondary source worth considering. The Sacramento Daily Record Union ran a brief item on the 17th of September, 1885, 3 days after Beaumont's official report, the same day as the departed notation in the ledger. It ran on the 4th page, in a column of miscellaneous city notes, and it reads in its entirety, "An elderly gentleman of foreign appearance and unusual dress was observed on K Street this week. He spoke little and departed without incident." The city clerk's office notes no record of settlement. The phrase "foreign appearance" is notable, and so is "spoke little." If the man was simply a local fraud, the paper would likely have said so or said nothing. Foreign appearance suggests something about the man, his features, his bearing, his manner, that did not read as American to the reporter who wrote that line. What country? What origin? The reporter does not say. The Sacramento case sits within a wider cluster of incidents that researchers in the Tartaria and pre-reset history communities have been cataloguing for the past decade. The methodology is not perfect. Some incidents in circulation are poorly sourced. Some have been embellished in retelling, and the community sometimes moves faster toward conclusion than the evidence supports. But the best documented cases share a set of features worth taking seriously on their own terms. Feature 1. Elderly individuals appearing in populated areas wearing military dress that cannot be identified by contemporary observers. Feature 2. Those individuals being lucid and non-threatening but unwilling or unable to provide documentation of their service. Feature 3. official records of those encounters being sparse, truncated, or absent, while private records, diaries, letters, informal notes contain significantly more detail. Feature 4. The individuals disappearing from the record entirely after a short period, with no follow-up documentation of where they went, what happened to them, or whether they were processed through any official system. The Sacramento case fits all 4 features. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. So does the St. Louis case of 1871, in which a man, uniformed in an unknown branch, was brought before a municipal judge and released after giving a name absent from any federal record. So does the Toronto case of 1883, in which a British colonial administrator wrote to London about a soldier of no regiment I know who appeared at a government reception and was quietly removed. The London response to that letter, if one was sent, is not in the files that survived. What would it mean if these incidents are what they appear to be? What would it mean if the man before Harold Beaumont in September 1885 had actually served in a military structure the historical record does not contain? It would mean, first, that the record gap is real, that there are periods of organized human activity in North America expunged from, or never entered into, the documentary trail we call history. Second, that the expungement was not total, that it left survivors, artifacts, traces. Third, that those traces were recognized as anomalous by the people who encountered them, and that those people made choices about whether and how to record what they saw. Beaumont made a choice. He wrote it down, crossed it out, and kept the diary instead of burning it, which means some part of him wanted the record to survive. That is its own kind of testimony. The uniform that cannot be placed, the buttons with the wheel insignia, the fabric with the wrong sheen, the place name that does not appear on any map. These are not proofs. They are residues, the material remaining after most of the evidence was lost, suppressed, or simply never collected. What they prove, at minimum, is that something happened on K Street in Sacramento in September 1885 that the available categories of explanation do not fully contain. There is another dimension the standard investigation of the Sacramento case tends to overlook, and it concerns the specific year 1885. The mid-1880s are a notable moment in the construction of American institutional memory. Several major historical projects were underway simultaneously. The official records of the War of the Rebellion, the National Pension System for Civil War veterans, state historical societies across the Midwest and West, systematic archaeological surveys of the interior. All of these were projects of historical consolidation, efforts to fix the record to decide, officially, what had happened and in what order and to whom. The timing matters because consolidation projects have an inherent function beyond their stated purpose. When you decide officially what is in the historical record, you simultaneously decide what is not. The pension system enrolled veterans of recognized conflicts. It had no category for veterans of unrecognized ones. State historical societies collected documents from the recognized past. They had no framework for documents that implied a different one. The official records documented the Union and Confederate armies in exhaustive detail. They had no entry for a regiment whose insignia looked like a wheel with rays. An old man in Sacramento in 1885, wearing a uniform from a war the official record had just finished, not mentioning, was walking into the worst possible moment to be anomalous. The machinery for deciding what was historical and what was not was running at full capacity, and the machinery had no slot for him. There is a specific argument made in some Tartaria research circles that the 1880s represent a period of active historical revision rather than passive consolidation. The distinction matters. Passive consolidation is what it looks like on the surface, institutions gathering and organizing existing records. Active revision is something different. a deliberate process of selecting which records to preserve, which to ignore, and which to remove, with the goal of producing a coherent narrative that excludes certain categories of evidence. The evidence for active revision in the 1880s is not conclusive, but it is not absent. Records were transferred out of public repositories, moved to private collections, restricted from access, or noted as missing in later catalogues. Newspaper archives are incomplete in ways that do not match ordinary decay. Specific dates gone, specific cities underrepresented. Municipal records were reorganized in ways that separated documents from their original context, making sequential reading impossible. None of this constitutes proof of a coordinated suppression campaign. Organizations lose records. Archives are reorganized for reasons of storage and access that have nothing to do with content. Gaps in newspaper files reflect the economic precarity of small papers, not conspiracy. But the pattern of gaps, viewed from the angle of what is missing rather than what is present, is not random. The gaps cluster around certain topics, regions, and periods. They cluster around the American interior before the Civil War. They cluster around territorial periods in states that entered the Union between 1840 and 1880. They cluster, with some regularity, around incidents involving individuals who do not fit the established record of who was present in North America and when. The old soldier in Sacramento is one data point in that cluster. He is not the whole argument, but he is the kind the argument requires a specific, documented, partially corroborated incident in which a human being appeared bearing physical evidence of a history the official record does not contain. What happened to him? The ledger says he departed on September 17. The newspaper item from that same day describes him on K Street and says he departed without incident. After that, nothing. No further sightings in the Sacramento papers. No pension record bearing the name Aldrin. No death record. No hospital record. No record of onward travel. He was in Sacramento for 3 days. The city that processed many thousands of transients each year kept no record of where he went. The most mundane explanation is that he moved on, walked, or rode to the next town, lived or died outside Sacramento's administrative reach, and left no further paper trail because elderly transients often did not. California in 1885 was full of people who lived and died without generating official records. It would not be surprising for one more to do the same. But the lack of follow-up is consistent with the pattern seen across the other uniform anomaly cases. In each instance, the individual appears, is briefly noted by someone outside the official system, and then vanishes in a way official records do not capture. The pattern does not prove anything about why documentation stops. It only establishes that it does stop, consistently, at the same point in each case. The Beaumont diary has been examined by 3 researchers in alternative history communities, and by 1 academic historian looking at California municipal records for an unrelated project. The academic noted the entry in a footnote, described it as an example of the period's tendency to pathologize transient behavior, and did not follow up on the uniform description. The 3 alternative researchers have each written about the case at length. The most careful points out that the diary does not prove the uniform was anomalous, only that Beaumont found it so, which is a different claim. The least careful has incorporated it into a broader argument about Tartarian military remnants that goes well beyond what the evidence supports. The honest position is somewhere in between. The evidence is real. The questions it raises are real. The answers are not available from the surviving record, and may never be. But the distance between "we cannot prove this" and "this did not happen" is significant, and it is worth inhabiting that distance rather than collapsing it. One final piece of evidence worth considering comes from an unexpected source. In 1903, a researcher named Clara Whitfield published a short monograph through a Sacramento printing house called The Forgotten Soldiers of the Pacific Coast, a title that sounds more dramatic than the content, which is a dry survey of pension records for California veterans of pre-Civil War conflicts. Whitfield was not a Tartaria researcher. She was a meticulous, methodical woman who had worked as a records clerk for the California State Assembly, and spent her retirement cataloguing pension discrepancies, veterans in state records but not federal records, veterans with service histories that did not match known conflict timelines, veterans whose discharge papers named units absent from regimental histories. Her monograph is largely forgotten. It was printed in a small run, never reviewed in major publications, and now exists in only 2 known copies, one at the California Historical Society, one at a private collector's home in Marin County. It is not digitized. In Chapter 4, Whitfield lists 11 cases of what she calls service of uncertain origin, veterans with documented pension applications whose service cannot be verified against any known unit. She treats it as an administrative problem, a record-keeping failure, a product of mid-century chaos. She lists the cases, gives names, dates, and the specific nature of each discrepancy. Case number 7 in her list is dated to a pension application filed in Sacramento in December 1885. The applicant's name is listed as A. Aldrin. The application claims service in a Frontier Defense Division, a northern district. The Bureau of Pensions returned the application as unverifiable. The applicant's stated age at time of filing was 78. His described uniform, as included in supporting documentation, involved, in Whitfield's clinical notation, buttons of non-standard issue and collar markings of unknown designation. Clara Whitfield does not connect this case to any September newspaper items or city clerk ledgers. She is not aware of Beaumont's diary. She is looking at pension records, not municipal documents, and has no reason to know that a man matching this description appeared in Sacramento 3 months before this application was filed. She lists the case and moves on. The pension application exists. Or it existed. Federal pension records for rejected applications from the 1880s are another category that did not survive uniformly into the present. The specific application Whitfield cites has not been located by any researcher since she cited it. The Bureau of Pensions archive for that period has gaps that may reflect ordinary decay or may reflect something else. A. Aldrin, age 78, in December 1885. Non-standard buttons. Unknown collar markings. Service in a Frontier Defense Division, Northern District, that no federal record acknowledges. He tried to claim a pension. That is a specific, non-theatrical act. A fraud does not file a pension claim for service in a unit he invented. There is no payoff. The Bureau would simply reject it, as they did. A man who filed that claim and accepted the rejection without further appeal, there is no record of Aldrin appealing, was not running a con. He was trying to do something ordinary, something veterans of actual service did, document what he had done, and receive recognition from a system that had no record of what he had done. The system said no. He left. Clara Whitfield found the paper trail 20 years later and noted it in a book nobody read. That is where the Sacramento case ends, not with a revelation, not with a definitive answer. It ends with a pension application, a rejected claim, and a notation in a forgotten monograph by a records clerk trying to tidy up the discrepancies in a system she had spent her life maintaining. The man in the uniform walked into Sacramento. He slept in a doorway. He was brought to the city clerk's office and questioned by a man who wrote down more than he officially admitted. He filed for a pension he did not receive. He departed. The city did not note where he went. The uniform had buttons, shaped like wheels, with rays. The collar insignia followed a pattern no branch of the American military has ever used. The fabric was heavier than wool and finer than wool should be, with a sheen that did not belong to it. He spoke of a place that could not be found on any map Harold Beaumont owned. Whatever that place was, it was real enough that he had served there. Real enough that he had put on the dress uniform and kept it across whatever years separated that service from a Sacramento doorway in 1885. Real enough that he walked into a government office and tried to file a claim for it. The record said no. The record always says no. But the record kept the diary. Clara Whitfield kept the list. And the wheel and ray buttons are still somewhere in the description of a city clerk who crossed out the most important thing he ever wrote and never could quite make himself destroy it. That is the evidence. That is what remains. The rest is the silence of archives that burned, or were moved, or were reorganized into forms that no longer connect to each other, and the long patience of questions that do not have answers yet.